And so today, we're going to continue on this conversation about what it means to walk in the way of Jesus as it pertains to how we relate to one another. And so one of our kind of key distinctives as a church is we want to be a multi-generational church. We want to be a place where the youngest among us are empowered to live out what God has called them to do, while the oldest among us are honored for their contribution and their wisdom as we seek to make a difference in our community. And if you're anything like me, you know that generationally, there are a lot of differences that exist between the oldest of us in the room and the youngest of us in the room. There's no doubt about that. And so we're taking on a pretty big challenge, in fact, by trying to and believing that we can be a church that is for everyone, for every person in every stage of life. In fact, it goes against the primary way that people are taught how to plant churches. Has anybody heard of the homogeneous person principle? Anybody heard of that before? Okay, I'm about to nerd out here for a second, all right? This is the way that we've been taught as church planners or pastors in seminaries to plant churches. We've been taught, decide what kind of person it is that you're interested in. Maybe say, I'm interested in a 37-year-old male who lives in the suburbs. And then basically what we've been taught is to design everything in our ministry to be attracted to a 37-year-old male. Because here's the idea. If you can find somebody that looks exactly the same, thinks exactly the same, you can collect as many people as possible, and that's how you can grow a large church. Here's the problem with that. Okay? The problem with that is that it does not create an environment for diversity, and it doesn't create an environment where the wisest and the youngest get to integrate together. In fact, it goes against everything that the Bible teaches about the way in which the church ought to interact. The church says things in Titus like that the older women ought to teach the younger women, or that the older men ought to teach the younger men, that marriages really flourish when young people have a vision and a picture of what it's like for a church or for a community to have families and couples that have been married for 60, 70 years. And when you approach church that way, by saying we're just going to reach a particular kind of person, you end up falling into a lot of marketing schemes that are nothing different than a targeted ad campaign on Facebook. And we want to be more than that. We want to live for a higher ideal, a higher vision for what the church can be. A church where it doesn't matter what color you are, what background you have, what language you speak, what decade or generation that you are a part of, you can find something here that you can hold on to and call home. Now, this is very hard work. It is harder than some of the other ways in which you can plant and start a church. And so today, what I want to do is take a little bit of time to talk about why we're so passionate about that and why we believe it's a part of what Jesus has laid out for a vision for his church. And so today's message is titled From One Generation to Another, and we're going to read Psalm 145, verses 1 through 8. And I'm going to ask you to do something we have never done before as a church. You guys ready to do this? Yeah? All right, here we go. While I'm reading these verses, there are going to be words that are in bold, okay? Bold is the ones that are thicker than the other letters, all right? And as we look at those bold words, I want you to say them, but I want you to say them with a little bit of chutzpah, okay? Can you do that? So we're going to practice, okay? There are 4 bold words up on the screen right now. We're going to practice it right now before we get into our scripture reading, because if we don't do this right, I'm going to be really disappointed, all right? I believe in you, and we can do it, all right? So we're going to do this one on the count of 3. I'll go back real quick to from one generation to another. Go back one slide. There you go. One generation to another. We're going to say that on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. That's good. Let's see if you can keep that up for 8 verses. We'll find out. Psalm 145, verses 1 through 8. You see the first bold word. Let's go. I will exalt you, my God, the King. I will praise your name forever and ever. Every day I will praise you and good. You saw it because the screen changed before I could get to it. Great is the Lord. You can go back. Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. His greatness no one can fathom. One. Good. Your works to another, they tell. Good job. Of your mighty acts, they speak. Of the glorious splendor of your majesty, and I will meditate on your wonderful works, they tell. Of the power of your awesome works, and I will proclaim your great deeds, they celebrate. Oh, let's do that again. They celebrate. Good. Your abundant goodness and joyfully sing. Of your righteousness. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and rich in love. Over the next 30 minutes or so, this is the only text that we're going to look at. I think it's powerful, these words that David writes about what it means to be a church that commends from one generation to another. But the first thing we've got to do is we've got to talk about what in the world is a generation. So we're going to answer 3 questions today. What is a generation? What is our responsibility to that generation? And then the last question that we're going to ask is, what do they need to know? So if you're taking notes or following along, you'll know where I am in the message because we'll be answering each of these questions. Here's the first one. What is a generation? What is a generation? Well, you can write this down. It's a group of people that share a similar season of life. And so there's a lot of work and research that's done on generational theory, looking at different reasons why people cluster together. And usually it used to be that you just take a certain time period and you would break it down, and that would be a certain generation. But you'll notice as we go through the generations that exist today, that has changed because of the advent of technology. There are so many things that technology has done that's changed the game, that what used to be a 25 or 30-year window where people were really in the similar stage of life has been condensed to about 15 years sometimes. And so here are the generations that might be in the room. The first one is the silent generation. If you are born between 1925 to 1945, you are a part of the silent generation. This is a generation that my grandmother was a part of. We celebrated her birthday yesterday. She was born and she was aware of and experienced segregation. She walked through that season. She's seen a lot, and she's an incredibly wise woman. Baby boomers. There are a lot of you. How many baby boomers in the house? Any baby boomers? Yeah, right. Baby boomers. You all exist because a group of guys went off to war for a long time. They came home and they had to make up for lost time, all right? And so the baby boomers, there are tons of you. There are so many, and you are retiring at an incredibly fast rate, and you're also living longer, which the government did not anticipate. Thank you for being here. Then we've also got Generation X, all right? Generation X is marked by really bright colors, all right? 1980s music, loving the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, MC Hammer, was Pong a Generation X thing? I think so, right? Yeah, all that stuff. Skateboarding, big hair. The mullet was hot back in the day, right? Business up front, party in the back, Some of you guys I know actually had a mullet. I've seen it, and I'm going to use it later on in life when I want something from you. All right, here's the next one. This is the group called the Millennials, all right? The Millennials are a group that is marked from 1980 to 1994. You really like your craft coffee. You spend $7 on a beverage. This is kind of the generation of the millennials. There's a lot of data that shows that millennials are some of the most creative and innovative generation that we've ever had. They've created things like Facebook and some other incredible technological pieces that are changing the game for us. And it's really because of millennials that we have the next generation that is up here. It's Generation Z, and that's anybody who was born after 1995. And so you'll notice that millennials and Generation Z are actually divided, right, in terms of age and in terms of length. To be a millennial was a small window of time. To be Gen Z was a smaller window of time than the other generations. And it's because of this, in 1995, Al Gore invented the internet, and that changed everything for everyone. And the advent of the internet has changed the game and the way that even Generation Z interacts with millennials. So there are 5 generations that are a part of our church, 5 generations that are apparent in our church family. But here's the thing about generational theory that you need to know. It's kind of a moving target. It's an imperfect science. And so this is one way for you to think about or to find yourself in the context of today's message. But I want to actually introduce to you a way of thinking about the generations that I think is really helpful when we think about what it means to be a local church and to be people who live out this vision that David paints in Psalm 145 about what it means to be a church. And it's really looking at something a little bit different. Not so much your age, not so much the era in which you were born, but more so the stage of life that you're a part of. And so I want to talk to you about the stages of maturity. The Bible talks a lot about this. I don't have time to kind of go into it in depth today, but this is something that we'll come back to a lot as a church. But there are 4 stages of maturity, and I want you to kind of find yourself in that journey and find yourself, maybe the people that you love, because there are 4 stages of maturity that all of us will walk through, God willing, during the course of our life. And so up here, you can write this down in your notes if you want to. This is kind of my note version that I use a lot when I'm coaching people or talking through what it means to kind of find yourself in your journey. But we start over here. Everybody starts as a lover, okay? And this is childhood in a lot of ways. And up here, I've got a high chair, right? And this, if you've ever had a kid or if you've ever been around a kid with a high chair, you know that the reason why they sit in this thing is because they cannot sit by themselves, right? So you strap them in because they'll slide out if you don't, and you have to feed them, right? And so children really are are in the stage of maturity, what we call the lover stage, where they're asking this question, am I lovable? Am I lovable? Can I be cared for? If you look at a lot of child development psychology, they'll tell you the number one question that a child is asking from the moment they are born is, am I lovable and do I belong? And so some of us right now, this is the stage that you're in. You are dependent upon your family, you're dependent upon your parents, and you're really asking this question, am I lovable? Am I worthy of love? Now, unfortunately, what happens in our culture is that far too often the transition to the next stage, which is the warrior stage, it happens too fast. And what I mean by that is that our kids grow up too quickly. The reality of a divorce makes their world kind of crumble a little bit, and they've got to figure out how to be an adult earlier than they were intended to be an adult. Or they go to school and they get in a fight, and they get parenting advice that says, hey, you need to fend for yourself and figure it out because life is tough and you've got to work that out. Of course, that's true, but the time that we tell that to our kids is really important. And so oftentimes what can happen is that people move out of the am I lovable stage into the warrior stage too quickly, and we see that in spades in our culture. The next stage is the warrior stage, and this is kind of early adulthood, and this is the question that you're asking in kind of early adulthood. Am I good enough? All right, so you're gone to college, and it's okay, I was good in school back then. Am I going to be good enough in school now? You can begin asking these questions about relationships. Am I going to find a spouse? Am I good enough for a relationship? Is somebody going to like me? Can I be successful in my work? And so oftentimes the reason why this is kind of signified by a ladder is because in the warrior stage, the question is, as you're finding your independence, you have this sense of destiny. I'm called to do incredible things. I'm going to be the next Fortune 500 CEO. I'm going to play in the NBA. I'm going to be the best husband ever, whatever it might be. And you basically build a ladder of success. And every person has done this. I've done it too. You begin to try and climb that ladder. And so whether or not the first rung is, getting through college, or the second rung is, getting that first job, or the third rung is, starting a family, or the fourth rung is, I'm not going to do that because I'm a little bit scared right now. Whatever that stage of life is that you are in, you are asking this question, am I good enough? Now, here's the unfortunate reality for many of us, is that when we were at this stage, we didn't necessarily have a really great framework for God's love for us and his care for us. And so we built a ladder against a wall, and we began to climb a bunch of rungs where we found out that we were successful, but in the wrong direction. I love how Francis Chan says it. He says, one of the greatest tragedies in life is to be successful at things that do not matter. And maybe you remember that season of your life, or maybe you're in that season of your life where you're asking this question, am I good enough? Now, you'll notice that while this transition is too fast sometimes, oftentimes the transition from the warrior to leader one, it's too slow, okay? It's the 30-year-old still living with you without a job or career, all right? That's what that is. It's the person who is kind of holding on to trying to figure out life in this season, in this rhythm, where it's still about them, right? It's still about them. The question is, am I? Well, then you move into the third stage of life, which is the leader stage of life. And I kind of consider this around middle age, right? And you're asking a different question here. You're not asking, am I good enough? Because you've either found out that you weren't, or you found out that you were, and now you're content with leading, and you have some degree of responsibility, maybe in your organization, maybe where you work, some responsibility at home. But you're asking a different question. That question transfers from am I to are we? And the question is, are we secure and safe? And I think most people, most of you in the room, probably have spent the majority of your life in this season. Are we secure and safe? Because now you're responsible. You're responsible for those people at your workplace, or you're responsible for the kids that are in your house, or you're responsible for this relationship that you've started, or you're responsible for people that you are leading, whether or not it be in business or in some other space or environment. And the questions you're asking in this season are a little bit different. Most of us spend most of our life in the leader seat. We are responsible for others. And then, for many of us, this transition is the hardest, okay? This is the CEO who should retire but doesn't retire because he doesn't know what else he would do, or she doesn't know what else she would do. This is the pastor who should stop preaching because all of his illustrations are from like 40 years ago, right? And he's not necessarily connecting anymore, but he doesn't know it because there's nothing else for him to do. Mental note, if that is ever me, like I think I've got a little bit of a window here, please, like be a good friend run to me and let me know, okay? Like one of my greatest fears in life is not making this transition well. But the transition from leader to sage, I think, is one of the most beautiful transitions if we can make it. And it's when you kind of sit back in the rocking chair and you look back, from your front porch, and you look back at life and you ask this question, am I leaving a legacy? You kind of see it in little grandkids that are running around. You kind of tear up if you've got kids and you see your kids kind of figuring out life. You're also tearing up if you're sitting over here in the sage stage and your kid's in the warrior stage and needs to be in the leader stage and hasn't made the transition yet, right? There might be a bunch of reasons for tears. But the sage is asking a different question, which is, am I finishing well? Have I run this race well? Have I made a difference in the life of the people that I love? Am I caring for people? And am I giving my wisdom away to others? This is what the sage is all about. And then, if you live long enough, you make the last transition, which is back to the lover, back to the dependency one, where literally you are in depends. Like that's where the situation that you're in. But you are able to look back on your life and see a different world and be able to just sit back and take stock at all that has happened. Yesterday, I got to drive down to Miami to celebrate my grandmother's 75th birthday. It was a surprise party that we had for her. She's an incredible woman, and every time I spend time with her, I hear a new story about her struggle that I did not know about, or I find a new nuance about her life that I had no clue about. And I'm so thankful, I'm so grateful that my daughters, who are 8 and 6, get to be a part of her life and get to have a front row seat to her story and to her legacy. And my grandmother's made an incredible transition through each of these spaces. There's about 80 people in the room, and there's a time when people just shared about how they had impacted her life. And it was amazing to me that of the people that are in the room, the people that were there that had college degrees, many of them had college degrees because my grandmother was the one who paid for them. The reason why they were in their vocation or careers because my grandmother took them in and trained them in the particular thing that they do. And my grandmother last night got to simply sit back at a chair that was designed just for her next to 2 balloons that said 75 and look out at a group of people, the youngest being my 1-year-old, up to people that were in their late 70s, 80s, 90s, to look at the impact that she's had on the people around her. And that's the life we all want. So as we talk about what it means to be a multicultural and really a multi-generational church, a church where no matter how old you are, you belong, I want you to kind of find yourself in the story and figure out what seat you're sitting in. Maybe you are in the lover stage, and that's great. We're so glad that you're here. Maybe you're in the warrior stage, and I want you to know that's a great season of life to be in. Embrace the destiny that you feel God has placed on your life and go after it with everything that you've got. Maybe you're in the leader seat right now, and you feel the weight and responsibility that life is not about you. You don't have time to think about you. It's really about those that you're supporting and caring for. Maybe you are in the sage stage. We are so grateful that you are here. We need you for this church to be what God has called it to be. So as we talk about the stages of maturity, I want you to ask this question: where are you in the journey? Where are you in the journey? So now we've covered what a generation is. Let's talk about our responsibility. What is our responsibility? Well, David gives it to us, and what I love about what we're going to talk about in the next couple of minutes is that what he explains in the next 8 verses takes something that can feel really weighty, right? Okay, I've got a responsibility to give something to the next generation. What in the world am I supposed to give them? That can seem kind of like a daunting question. David's going to make it really, really, really easy for us, and he's going to narrow it down to a couple of things. So it starts with this: what is our responsibility? Here's the answer. One generation commends your works to another. Now, I had you say all of these words in bold when we did the scripture reading. I want to pull them up back in because this tells us our responsibility. Look, our responsibility is to commend, to tell, to celebrate, to speak, to exalt, to extol, to praise, to meditate, to proclaim, and to joyfully sing. There's a theme here that David is giving to us that I've kind of whittled down to a sentence that you can write down. This is our responsibility, okay? Our responsibility is to make a really big deal. That's a deep theological term. Really big deal about God to the next generation. That's your job. That's my job. Our responsibility, if you had to kind of say, what is the primary job description of every single person in this church? It's this right here. Our job is to make a really, really big deal about God to the next generation. No matter what seat we're sitting in, no matter what season of life that we're in, there are people that are looking towards us, and our job is to make a really big deal about God. Well, what do they need to know then? right? Okay, I need to make a really big deal about God. Well, help me. What is it that they need to know? David gives us 3 things that if you were to orient your life around this, if you were to prioritize your life around these things, parents, let me talk to you because I know sometimes it can feel really daunting thinking, okay, how am I supposed to raise a kid who loves Jesus and walks with Jesus? There's so much that seems to be complicated about that. I want to give you 3 themes that if you apply in your life can transform your home, transform your family, and transform any person that you have influence over. Here's what we're going to find. What do they need to know? Write this down. Number 1, God is greater. Write that down in your notes. God is greater. This is the number 1 thing that people need to know. Psalm 145 says it this way: great is the Lord, his greatness no one can fathom, the glorious splendor of your majesty. These are the words that are found in Psalm 145, verses 1 through 8. These are all capturing this idea that God is great. There is no one greater than him. He's the biggest deal in the world, which begs this question: are we helping the next generation know that God is greater than insert whatever you want? Is God greater than the grades they get at school? That's the question that I think a lot of people are asking here. Is God greater than how successful they can get in life? Is God greater than whether or not we can have the perfect family and make sure we're the best leaders ever? Is God greater than if we're sitting over here, sages, worried about life, thinking, my goodness, this place is going to hell in a handbasket? Is God greater than that kind of perspective or view? You know, I think if there's a sin or maybe a struggle of the North American church, it has been this, is that we have lost our awe of God. Here's what I mean by that. We have grown up over the last 30 years or so where the primary version of church has been self-help sermons where you are the center of the story. Where every teaching and the primary messages are about how your life can get better, how you are so important, how you are so significant. And the problem with that is this, is that you are loved, an incredibly beautiful, brilliant work of God, but you are not the point. You guys get that? Like, you're not the point. Like, it would be foolish to think that we're the point, right? Like, it would be ridiculous, right, for somebody to paint a beautiful painting and for somebody to walk up to that painting and say, oh my goodness, this painting is amazing, and just stop there, right? The question is, who painted it? And so oftentimes we lose our awe and our wonder of the majesty and the incredible nature of our Creator. And as a result of that, we forget that God is actually greater, that he has no rival, that he has no equal, that there literally is nothing in life that God is not greater than. And that's what the next generation needs to know. I actually want to read 2 quotes to you from Paul David Tripp. He writes a book called Awe that I would commend to you and recommend to you. I think it's a game-changing book. And this is what he says. And I think it particularly engages with why so many people in Generation Z and millennials, mostly people who are living in this space right now, are walking away from church in droves. I mean, we're in an era right now where people who are 18 and younger, for the first time in our nation's history, there are more people who do not believe in Jesus than people who do, okay? And I think the reason why isn't because they didn't go to church. They went to church. It's just that the version of church that they've received is a version of church that centers on them as the center of the story instead of God, who is so much greater. So look what Paul David Tripp said. He says, every year, thousands of supposedly Christian young people forsake the faith. I would propose to you that they are not forsaking the faith at all. They never had it in the first place. They grew up under a system of control that forced the faith upon them, but when they got to college and the system vanishes, their true hearts reveal themselves. I mean, this is a part of my story. Maybe it's a part of your story. Maybe the reason why you walked away from faith and you struggle to even come back to church now and you're wondering, okay, should we do this? Should we not do this? I guess it might be important for the kids. If you ever had a season in your life like me where faith seemed dead, it felt like a joke and not something to be a part of it's because it felt like what I grew up in was a system of control. The faith that I was handed down in some ways, and I don't fault my parents for this, I think it's the era that we were a part of, was all about make sure that you don't have sex, make sure that you listen only to Christian music, and make sure that you feel bad about yourself when you don't listen to Christian music and when sex enters into your life, okay? Anybody know what I'm saying, right? Like the reality was like, hey, don't do all of the fun stuff. That's what being a Christian is. And then you realize, well, the fun stuff's kind of fun. I'm not sure I want to do that. And when that system of control breaks off of you and you head into to college and you find newfound freedom all of a sudden, and you find that, man, those people that were so bad aren't necessarily that bad. In fact, they're kind of nicer than the Christians that I grew up with. They're just more honest about their stuff because the Christians were doing it anyway, so is this all a joke? And so we've got to acknowledge this, right? That if we're going to give a faith worth handing off to the next generation, it's got to be a faith that's centered around the idea that God is greater. He's greater. Hey, don't have sex not because sex is bad for you. Don't have sex while you're not married because of this. Sex is incredible. It's life-changing. It's some of the most fun I have. Like, it is a good thing. But God's designed it to be in the context of a relationship where you are loved and cared for and known and you belong, and there is no doubt that the person that you're with is going to be with you forever. And they've said that not because they've used words, because they put a ring on it in front of a bunch of people. That is the right season, and God's greater. His vision of your life is greater than cheap imitations of that. Hey, don't go get crazy wasted and committed to all of these other substances. They're going to mess up your life. Not because if you do it, you're a bad person. Don't do it because God has a greater plan for your life, and all of those things are just impediments to the beautiful story that he's got prepared for you. See God as this amazing, greater person. How many of us would have been in such a far better place if that was the vision of God that we were given as kids? Tripp puts it this way. He says, no awesome thing in creation was meant to give you what only the Creator is able to give. Every awesome thing in creation is designed to point you to the one who alone is worthy of capturing and controlling the awe of your searching and hungry heart. So feel free to have that really delicious meal that costs a little bit more money. Just know it's not about the meal, it's about the Creator. Feel free to go on that awesome vacation and enjoy the trip. Just know as you're looking over the precipice of the Grand Canyon is awesome, but the one who's awesome is the one who created it. Enjoy the dating relationships that you're in. And every time that you're in a dating relationship, realize it's not about the person you're dating. It's about the fact that God has created somebody with a personality that you're attracted to. And attraction is this incredible thing. Do you see how awe is so important? That God is greater. I love this about my kids right now because we're trying to instill in them this idea that God is greater. And we're doing it in a variety of ways, but one of the ways that we're trying to do it is through music. And so we're driving down to South Florida yesterday, and we play this game where our girls and our boys, now Jackson, they all get to pick a song, and we play the song that's in rotation. Here's the problem, they only pick like 2 songs. And so it's like a 4-hour drive, and it's like I can only handle so much of Toby Mac before I don't like the guy. I can't do this. Right? And so Elise is singing this song about, I love the way you hold me. It's this Toby Mac song. It's about God's greatness. And then, Emma, is picking a song by Ariana Grande. It's like, Jesus, we got to pray for her, and then, Jackson jumps in and he's like, my God is so big, so strong, and so mighty. There's nothing my God cannot do. But not the version you grew up with, like as a little kid, where it's like, my God is so big, so strong. No, it's like big bass banging, like you feel like you're in a club, that kind of thing, right? And this is the dynamic in my car, and it's just over and over and over again. But here's the thing, right? Here's the thing. My kids are getting introduced to, at an early age, the greatness and the grandeur of God. And it is my job as their parent to continually point to them that in the small things and in the big things, God is greater. God is greater than the medical diagnosis that Daddy got last year. God is greater than the concern about what happened at school because he's actually in it. God is greater than your worry about whether or not you're going to make the cheerleading team or not, because God is in everything. This needs to be the legacy that we're handing off, not only to our kids, but sages. We need to hear this from you. Sages, I'm sitting over here in the leader seat thinking, my goodness, is this thing all up to me? Is this a house of cards? Is this whole thing going to burn? And I need a sage to look at me and pat me on the shoulder and say, Collin, it's okay. God is greater than your concerns and your worries. I remember what it felt like to be in that stage. And let me tell you, 20 years on the other side, he comes through. He always comes through. We need to hear those things from one another. God is greater. Here's the second one. We need to teach our kids, we need to teach the next generation that God is working. God is working. Psalm 145 says this, your works to another, your mighty acts, your wonderful and awesome works, your great deeds. These are the things that we're declaring. These are the things that we're making a really big deal about. So here's the question I want you to write down. Are we helping the next generation see where God is working here and now? And here's how we do it. It's in the stories that we tell. It's in the vulnerability that we're willing to have and the openness in which we're willing to share. Like one of the most frustrating things in the world to me is to be in the leader chair, to be around other leaders, right? And they've got some warriors in their life, right? These are people that are on their staff. These are people that they're friends with. They're people in a stage of life that's a little bit different. And the people that are sitting here are not willing to tell the stories of how God is at work in their life or what God has done to make a big difference. It's because these people need to know. They need to know that when it doesn't seem like God is working, he's actually working. They need to know when they're trying to climb this ladder of whatever version of success that they're trying to climb, that when they fail, it's okay because a failure does not have to define your life. That God is greater than any failure or mistake that you can make. That God is working. That's why I love the fact that my kids go to church in a YMCA. You know why? Because every single week they see God working. Every single week, they see a group of people gathered, not because the environment's great, not because it's super comfortable, not because this is the place that, has the most beautiful aesthetic. They see a group of people that are passionate about Jesus and passionate about each other. They get a front row seat to the miracle of seeing people get baptized. That's why I make sure that my kids are always at the side of a baptism. Because you know what my kids need to know? They need to know that God is in the process of changing people's lives. And it doesn't matter how old you are or where you've been or what you've done. God is still at work. That's why I make sure they're out there every single time we do a baptism. My kids know the story, right? About how God has given us a piece of property. And how it wasn't because we were really smart or savvy or cool or were able to negotiate really well, but because of a series of circumstances that started with a conversation with two people that do not go to our church. We're now in possession of property that one day my kids are going to get to see a building go up on. But they know that it isn't just because we worked hard that we got it. They know it's because God is working that it happened. So let me ask you this question. Who are the people in your life that know that you are where you are, not because of your own success or your story, but because of God and how he entered into your life? Because we have that God is at work story, don't we? We've got that conversation about, hey, I was in this one place, had this one conversation, this one thing happened, then all of a sudden, boom, my life was changed forever. Or, hey, I was supposed to go here, and I couldn't go there, and the door was closed, and so I had to end up doing something else that I didn't really want to do, but not having to do the thing I didn't want to do actually led me to the relationship that I actually needed, and God answered all of my prayers by saying no. Are we telling these stories? Because our kids need to hear them, young people need to hear them, your friends need to hear them, and my gosh, our community group should be a full-on engagement of story after story after story saying, God is at work, God is at work. Look at what God is doing. Here's the third thing, God is good. Look what David writes. He says, your abundant goodness, your righteousness. He says, you're gracious and compassionate, you're slow to anger and rich in love. Here's the question I want to leave you with. Are we helping the next generation trust that God is good? Do you know how good of a place it is to be in your life to know that God is good? I mean, no matter what situation or circumstance you're in, if you can hold to the fact that God is good in your life, doesn't it change any situation? But if you don't believe that God is good, maybe you believe that God is kind of up in heaven, kind of with his arms crossed, kind of upset, right, waiting for you to make a mistake. He's got, a thunderbolt, he's got some lightning, right, and he's just like shaking it like a, set of dice thinking, I can't wait till you make that decision. Well, bam, like if that's the way you think of God, then mercy, what a rough situation you've got ahead of you. But parents, how are we parenting our kids? Do our kids know that God is gracious because we are gracious to them? That we're not gracious because we're lazy. Because there are days I don't want to discipline my kids and call it grace, but the reason I don't want to discipline my kids is just because I'm tired of it, right? No, do my kids know that when they make a mistake, I sit down with them and say, hey, what you did was wrong, and I should give you this punishment, but I'm not going to give you this punishment because God has shown us this thing called grace. And grace says that you get unmerited favor even when you don't deserve it. Man, if we're parenting our kids and what we're trying to do is modify their behavior, get them to do what we want them to do, and we're actually teaching them this vision or this picture of parenting that's all about you do what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it, and there is no grace in our life, do not be surprised when the idea of a God of grace seems foreign to them. Because their vision for who God is as Father will come from the way that we parent them. Leaders, sitting over here in this chair, Are you grace-filled towards your employees and your staff and the people that you're responsible for? Or are you somebody who's really, really quick to throw a barb or to say something that's negative? And instead of lifting up the warriors who are asking the question, am I good enough? You're telling them, no, you're not good enough. In fact, your value is diminished because you cannot perform. Or are we looking them in the eye and saying who you are is what matters most? Let me coach you and let me teach you how to become all that God has called you to be. Sages in the room, my wise people, those of us who are so worried about the future of the next generation, right? This country's going the wrong way, right? There's all of these problems that are in the world. This is the worst that it's ever been. All of these kind of narratives, right, that oftentimes we can have here as we sit back in this seat. Are we extending grace and acknowledging, man, when I was 20, I did some crazy things too that I wish nobody else knew about? The problem is, or the good news is that when I was 20, there wasn't Facebook to chronicle it, so everybody knew, right? Are we extending grace to those that are on their path, trying to figure out their journey, collecting their testimony, making their mistakes, the same mistakes that we made, we just like to forget about because our distance allows us to stay further away from it? Are we gracious with the leaders who are still figuring it out, who are in a different stage of life than we are, and recognizing while they're on their journey as well? Sages, let me talk to you for a minute. Our church is not who it is without you. It is not what it is without you. The wisdom that you bring, the insight that you bring, the patience that you give, the warmth that you bring to our church, it is a game changer. And all of us, no matter what stage of life that we're in, need to recognize that we have an opportunity every single day with the decisions we make, the conversations we have, and the way that we relate to others to either teach people about a God who is kind and compassionate and slow to anger, like Psalm 145 talks about, because we are kind and compassionate and slow to anger. Or we can continue to prop up a version of God that allows people to be afraid and nervous and worried and disconnected. And we are, look at me, we are the sermons that people are hearing preached every single day. You get me for 30 or 40 minutes, okay? You are a preacher 24/7 in the places where you work, where you live, and where you play. And there are people who will never come into this space who are looking at you as a primary example of what God is like. Are you hearing me? You might be the primary example for your coworker, for your friend, for your child, for your neighbor, as to what God is like. So, here's what I want you to know. Someone somewhere is looking to you to help them know what God is like. Someone somewhere is looking to you to help them know what God is like. So, who's my responsibility to? Wherever you find yourself in this journey, your responsibility is to the next generation. Okay? What am I supposed to tell them? What am I supposed to make a really big deal about? Make a really big deal about the fact that God is greater than any situation that they are ever going to face in their life. Help them recognize that God is good and he's for them, not against them. And walk closely with them in relationship so that the best testimony they have, maybe the only Bible they'll ever read, is your life.